Greetings, everyone. East Asian NATO has arrived, shaking Asia's tense geopolitical landscape with one of the century's most dramatic events. The American superpower appears to be losing its edge, unintentionally giving Beijing the chance to shape the region's fate as an old force rises again. No longer just warnings on paper, a battle to counter the rise of the Chinese dragon is unfolding right before our eyes. Here are the main points in the video. The Steel Alliance overcomes long-standing animosities, shocking China as Japan partners with South Korea, builds strong ties with the Philippines and Australia, and forms the basis for a NATO-like military alliance in Asia. The terrifying fury of Beijing, the truth about the massive blockade rehearsal using thousands of disguised maritime militia vessels, the tense airspace lockdowns over Okinawa, and the harsh economic sanctions aimed at forcing Tokyo to bow down. The harsh balance of power. Can Japan's 154 warships stand firm against China's formidable standing fleet and its war machine worth hundreds of billions of dollars? Here is the detailed content and analysis. Activating the Asian NATO alliance. Can Japan stop China? Ladies and gentlemen, the geopolitical landscape in the Asia-Pacific is witnessing an extremely fierce historic turning point, where the shadow of a new era of Chinese hegemony is no longer a distant warning, but is now right before our eyes. On the prestigious Diplomatic Forum Foreign Policy, Professor of International Relations Stephen Kwong from Harvard University has sounded a powerful alarm about this inevitable rise of Beijing. Strategic analysts point out that, through a series of decisions to withdraw from international institutions, imposing extreme tariffs globally, and pushing the Middle East into turmoil through the war in Iran, which has caused global fuel prices to skyrocket, President Donald Trump's administration has inadvertently handed over the fate of this region to China on a silver platter. In his sharply critical assessment, Professor Watt asserts that every move by the White House looks no different from a calculated plan to help Beijing completely replace America's position in this crucial strategic buffer zone. This warning bell is not an isolated one. Many years ago, veteran Singaporean diplomat Kishore Mahbubani, former chairman of the United Nations Security Council, continuously analyzed this big picture in his famous work, Has China Won? This shift in power puts an end to the effort to contain Beijing, which has been the backbone of Washington's foreign policy in Asia, marking the most shocking strategic setback for the United States. As the power balance between Washington and Beijing shifts, East Asia's geopolitical landscape becomes uncertain, and the U.S. appears to lose its strategic position. The greatest hope for regional order now rests with an island nation that is 25 times smaller than China, a former military power rising strongly from the ashes. That is Japan. Throughout the post-war period, Tokyo's security doctrine has been very simple and passive, serving as a solid rear base for the U.S. military, sharing the financial burden, and leaving all actual combat operations to Washington. That order may have functioned smoothly during the Cold War era, but it was based on an extremely fragile premise, the absolute and lasting commitment of the U.S. to the region. When trust in the loyalty of their ally across the ocean began to crack, Japan's political elite understood that they could not leave the fate of their nation to such an unpredictable and shifting reality. This strategic awakening sparked a landmark military reform under the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the chief architect of Japan's Great Rearmament. In 2015, despite fierce debates and heated protests among the public, the Abe administration unilaterally overcame legal barriers by passing a law that allowed Japan's self-defense forces to engage in combat under limited collective self-defense conditions. This was an unprecedented turning point, allowing Tokyo to open fire if an allied nation was attacked, and that threat directly affected Japan's survival, breaking the old constitutional chains that only permitted the use of force when Japanese territory itself was invaded. This bold move opened the door to a series of subsequent wide-ranging military reforms. By 2017, the most invisible yet solid barrier, the defense spending cap limited to 1% of GDP, was officially removed. Immediately after that, in 2018, Tokyo established the Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, an elite task force specifically designed for the defense and recapture of remote islands. An unmistakable deterrent message was sent directly to Beijing amid the tense standoff in the East China Sea. Not stopping there, the plan to convert Izumo-class destroyers to operate a squadron of 147 F-35B stealth fighters has turned these warships into Japan's first true aircraft carriers since World War II, even though Tokyo officials have always had to use diplomatic language to downplay the sensitivity of the issue. If former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was the one who laid the first bricks for the wall of rearmament, then his successor, who was also his outstanding protege, then Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, is the one pushing this process to its utmost limit. According to the insightful assessment of Professor Daisuke Kawai from the University of Tokyo, no politician has shown a stronger and more determined commitment than Ms. Takaichi in this geopolitical gamble. This past April, she announced the most comprehensive and bold overhaul in decades of Japan's arms export regulations, completely lifting the long-standing bans on overseas arms exports, paving the way for the transfer of advanced guided missile systems and modern warships to allies in the region. This move has created a wave of excitement throughout Southeast Asia, especially in the Philippines. Philippine Defense Minister Kim Gimberto Teodoro openly stated to the media that this agreement allows Manila to access advanced weaponry, increases domestic defense capabilities, and strengthens regional security through a strategic deterrence mechanism, a statement that observers consider a direct blow to China's sovereignty claims. At the same time, Prime Minister Takaichi has realized the increase of the defense budget to a record 2% of GDP and pledged not to stop there. This escalation in military spending has made Beijing uneasy, pushing the tense atmosphere to its peak. However, what truly brought the risk of conflict to the brink was Prime Minister Takaichi's geopolitically explosive statement before the parliament last November. Prime Minister Takaichi firmly asserted that any military attack by China targeting Taiwan could be considered a situation that directly threatens Japan's survival. This statement means that Tokyo is ready to invoke the 2015 collective self-defense law from the Abe era to send troops into battle, standing side by side to defend Taiwan. This is a critical blow that touches the most sensitive red line for Beijing. China's reaction immediately erupted into an extremely serious diplomatic and military fury. Beijing harshly accused the Takaichi administration of deliberately reviving the specter of colonialism in the Japanese military, a highly provocative accusation based on historical wounds that have not yet healed. On the economic front, China immediately launched sanctions by advising its citizens to stop traveling to Japan, suspending all seafood imports, and issuing an export ban on dual-use goods to 20 major industrial corporations believed to be weapon suppliers for the Japanese military. The deterrence did not stop at the negotiating table or in economic sanction documents. It has turned into military actions on the brink of open fire. In December last year, Chinese fighter jets carried out dangerously aggressive maneuvers targeting Japanese patrol aircraft, forcing Tokyo to urgently scramble interceptor fighters in a tense aerial standoff. All these relentless moves by Beijing had a single purpose: to force Prime Minister Takaichi to bow his head and apologize. However, up to now, the Japanese female leader has remained steadfast under immense pressure from the mainland, and public opinion polls show that her firm, unyielding stance has even helped her solidify absolute support from the people at home. Beijing's reactions to Japan's military resurgence have gone far beyond ordinary trade embargoes or simulated dogfights in the skies over Okinawa. Behind the velvet curtain of diplomacy, a shocking event took place during the summit talks between President Donald Trump and Chairman Xi Jinping. According to valuable revelations from the Financial Times, the Chinese leader could not hide his anger and insecurity as he directly criticized Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's strategy to increase Japan's defense capabilities. For a leader who always builds an image of calmness and absolute control like Mr. Xi Jinping, revealing psychological vulnerability right in front of Washington officials is clear evidence that Beijing is truly shaken by Tokyo's moves. That shock was immediately made concrete by figures that reeked of gunpowder. A report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute pointed out that China quietly increased its defense budget by 7.4% last year, pushing total spending to a massive $336 billion, a figure that observers know is just the tip of the iceberg due to the country's notorious lack of transparency. Moving into this year, despite economic difficulties, Beijing has continued to pump another 7% into its war machine. At the National People's Congress of China, Prime Minister Li Qiang made a threatening statement that the country's military will focus fully on enhancing its combat capabilities and being ready for any conflict situation, a message of intimidation that hangs over the entire continent. The underlying reason why the continental superpower is so uneasy is not just Japan's rearmament, But more frighteningly, the Grand Regional Alliance strategy to isolate China, which Ms. Takaichi is actively orchestrating. The heart of this alliance is an unimaginable move that breaks all historical norms, the handshake between Japan and South Korea. The deep-seated animosity stemming from the harsh colonial period between 1910 and 1945 with war crimes that seemed irreparable has lasted for generations. Those wounds bled fiercely again in 2018 when the South Korean Supreme Court ruled that Japanese companies must compensate for forced labor during the war, sparking a brutal trade war between Tokyo and Seoul. This pushed the alliance between the two democratic nations to the brink, and their relationship was only tenuously maintained due to pressure from Washington. Yet, under the leadership of Prime Minister Takaichi, a new and dramatic chapter has been written. In just half a year, she and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung have held 4 lightning-fast summits, an unprecedented frequency in modern history. At the summit in Nasa, the hometown of the female prime minister, the two leaders reached a historic agreement to strengthen bilateral security ties, indirectly building a solid wall to block Beijing's expansionist ambitions, something both sides strongly reaffirmed just a few days ago. But with the Tokyo-Seoul axis, Japan's diplomatic reach continues to extend down to the South China Sea and the South Pacific. The decision to lift restrictions on Tokyo's defense industry immediately turned the country into a strategic lifeline for Manila. Not stopping at providing equipment, a tax-free military logistics agreement covering ammunition, essentials, and fuel has been signed, creating a solid foundation for the implementation of the Visiting Forces Agreement, which allows the two countries' militaries to be present directly on each other's territory for joint exercises and to be ready to respond to any security incidents. Going further south, Tokyo established a massive military and economic alliance with Australia through a $6.5 billion warship construction contract designed by Japan. At the same time, a $10 billion energy gamble called Power Asia was also launched, aiming to secure resources for the entire continent against threats and blockades. All these independent and tough moves have created a geopolitical pincer that squeezes China's ambition for sole dominance in the Asian seas. This life-and-death confrontation strategy is receiving an unprecedentedly strong political backing at home. When national surveys record an approval rating for the female prime minister as high as 70%, it's an unimaginable number that any Western government would envy. The die is cast, the cards are on the table, and the pressing question now is whether the ambitious Steel Alliance led by the Land of the Rising Sun has enough strength to stop the pincer movement of the Chinese dragon, which is brimming with momentum and preparing for a major war, or if East Asia will have to witness a new bloody chapter in the history of global conflict. The contrast in forces on both sides of the front line is stark. While Tokyo possesses only about 100 warships in its entire maritime self-defense force, Beijing already commands a formidable standing fleet of 234 modern warships, and that doesn't even include the thousands of militia vessels always ready to defend. This absolute dominance allows China to continuously deploy sophisticated and resolute gray zone tactics to pressure its neighboring countries. According to the East Asia Forum, China's Coast Guard forces have maintained a provocative presence for 335 consecutive days around the Senkaku Islands, which are administered by Japan, an increase from 215 days the previous year. This aggression does not spare anyone in the region. Over the Taiwan Strait, Beijing's fighter jets have violated the island's airspace more than 3,700 times, accompanied by more than 2.8 million cyber attacks every day aimed at crippling the opponent's defense systems, a sharp increase from the 2.4 million attacks per day the previous year. In the South China Sea, Vietnamese and Philippine vessels are constantly harassed and bullied with force, while the Australian Air Force faces dangerous close encounters and blatant challenges to international law from Chinese fighter jets. On the non-military front, Beijing is also intensifying its two-horse race with Japan through the Belt and Road Initiative. By using invisible debt traps tied to megaprojects, China is weaving a massive network of influence that far surpasses Tokyo's reach. Whether these countries are willing to rush to Beijing's aid when gunfire breaks out remains a big question, but China's coercive soft power is an undeniable reality. In the face of such a solid and aggressive wall, are Japan's rearmament efforts enough to turn the tide? The frank and objective answer from political observers is no. What Tokyo has achieved in the past decade from a military perspective is extremely impressive, but it is still too small to put Japan on equal footing or challenge the rising trajectory of the Asian dragon. Tokyo's biggest obstacle is time. While China has spent decades building up its military strength, accumulating economic power, and perfecting its Belt and Road strategy globally, Japan has only truly awakened since 2015. And this process was quite slow until Prime Minister Takachi appeared and accelerated it. In hard cash terms, even though Japan has raised its budget to a record 2% of GDP equivalent to 62.2 billion USD, that number is still just a drop in the bucket. Compared to China's enormous budget of 336 billion USD, whose actual spending is always suspected to be much higher than what is reported. Economically, China is the lifeblood of the entire region, so Japan's economy cannot shoulder or replace that massive supply chain on its own. Even more frightening is the demographic crisis, which the Japanese government admits is a threat to its very survival. The land of the rising sun is witnessing a tragic situation where the number of deaths exceeds the number of births by nearly 1 million people, marking the most severe population decline since records began in 1968. Although China is also facing the problem of an aging population, their level of vulnerability is not as critical and urgent as Japan's. However, the history of world wars has proven that statistics do not determine everything. If we only look at the budget and troop numbers, the Russian military could have held a victory parade in Kyiv instead of having to anxiously fear President Zelensky's counterattacks right in Moscow. Washington could have imposed its will on Iran instead of constantly making concessions at the negotiating table. Japan is clearly the weaker party in this direct confrontation, but questioning whether Tokyo can balance power with Beijing might be a strategic thinking mistake. Japan's real goal is not to become an equal rival, but to make itself a reliable alternative for countries that are suffocating under China's dominance, but don't know who to rely on. For many years, Asian governments have had to walk a tightrope between accepting China's infrastructure investment and trying to protect their sovereignty from Beijing's aggression. The Philippines is a prime example of this geopolitical paradox. The biggest and most vital strategy for Tokyo right now is to bring together the fragmented pieces in the region into a military alliance with a structure similar to NATO to counter China's brutality. The foundation of this strategy was laid when Japan tightened its military ties with most neighboring countries, and as its defense industry opens up, these bonds will become even stronger. Moreover, these countries already have close security ties with the United States through bilateral agreements. The last obstacle is the political will of the parties. Any country that dares to stand on the same front as Japan will face unprecedented, frenzied, and brutal retaliation from Beijing, even a comprehensive economic blockade. So, in your opinion, can an Asian NATO led by Japan be strong enough to break China's expansionist grip on the ground? Or is it already too late?